put this down to a reasonable level. This goes up and down very easy. I see. If it's a problem, just give me a second. That's good. Well, we almost had a wonderful circumstance here. The chairman said to me, I have a little trouble with those left lights on the left. And I said, well, if they're a problem, we'll turn them down. And he said, well, maybe I'll just ad lib. And I think we ought to turn all the lights up and see if we can get them to ad lib. Well, good afternoon again, ladies and gentlemen. As you know, I'm Tom Donahue, president of the Chamber. I think you'll agree this has been an incredibly informative few hours, starting with Frank Raines at this meeting, and actually starting in this room with the Vice President, and continuing through our chief economist panels. And we've heard from some of the brightest people in the field, and of course, we were talking inside, there were some ambidextrous comments on the other hand. Though we're experiencing some challenging times right now, our economy, in my view, and in the view of a lot of the people who are here, is still the strongest and the most resilient in the world. Why? We think there are several reasons, the most significant being the hard work and entrepreneurial spirit of the American people. And immediately another reason, without question, is the leadership that we have seen on monetary policy from our central bank, and, by the way, on other related issues that are important to our economy. We now have the distinct privilege of hearing from the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, a person with perhaps the most unique perspective on the U.S. economy, Alan Greenspan. He has been writing, speaking, and consulting the heads of government, private firms, and others about this for a lifetime. He's currently serving his 4th term as the head of the Federal Reserve, where he has overseen monetary policy under Presidents Reagan, Bush, Clinton, and now Bush. Chairman Greenspan has seen our country through the Cold War and its end, the market crash of '87, the Gulf War, the recession of the early '90s, and the rise and fall of the dot-com era. He's provided the leadership that we need to help sustain a strong economy that, as we all agree, is the envy of the world. The chairman's had a distinguished career in both public and private sector, as I mentioned. He founded the economic consulting firm in New York City of Townsend Greenspan and Company, which he headed from 1954 to '87 when he joined the Fed. He took a hiatus from his firm from '74 to '77 to serve as the chairman of the President's Council of Economic Advisors under President Ford. So we have to add another president. And acted as chairman of the National Commission on Social Security Reform in 1981 to '83. I think that was 12 Social Security commissions ago. Bob Woodward calls him the maestro. Several others have described him as the most powerful person in the country. Wall Street watches his every word, marks his every move, and notes his every grin. Turn up the lights, guys. Chairman Greenspan has even introduced new language to our vocabulary, coining popular terms such as irrational exuberance. Though one of the brightest minds in government, the chairman's closest friends and the people who know him best described him first as honest, trustworthy, and very, very unpretentious. No Federal Reserve chairman has been more aggressive in managing our nation's monetary policy or more open with what he doesn't know. Asked about the Fed's 10 interest rate cuts this year, Nobel Prize-winning economist Milton Friedman last week said that the chairman's direction of the Fed is without precedent. I know you're as eager as I am to hear what the chairman has to say on the state of the economy, and so as I introduce him in 1 minute, I have to give you one piece of intelligence. This could be really interesting because the chairman arrived back in Andrews Air Force Base sometime at 2 or 3 o'clock this morning. He and I are both nappers, but I'm not sure how much of a nap he has, so maybe we could catch him with a little irascible exuberance. Mr. Chairman, Alan Greenspan. This goes up and down with this switch right there.
Well, thanks very much, Tom. I'm allegedly awake, and we're about to find out whether or not that insight is correct. it is an interesting experience to try to get by on about 2 hours sleep. You feel wonderful after the first 2 hours, and then something happens to the human species which I've never been able to solve, but it's a delight to be with you this afternoon. As you can hear, my voice is a little bit raspy. I'm still recovering from sort of a mild laryngitis, but it goes up and down, I guess, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average. As economic policymakers understandably focus on the impact of the tragedy of September the 11th and the further weakening of the economy that followed those events, it is essential that we do not lose sight of the policies needed to ensure long-term economic growth. As I indicated to the Baker Institute in Houston last night, one of the most important objectives of those policies should be an assured availability of energy in this country. That imperative has, if anything, been elevated by the heightened tensions in the Middle East, an area that harbors 2/3 of the world's proven oil reserves. This afternoon, I would like to first review our recent experiences with prospective imbalances in energy supply and demand, and the importance of market prices in resolving those imbalances. Then I plan to focus on the extraordinary role played by technology in augmenting potential energy supplies, particularly of oil and gas. Technology alone is unlikely to restore the United States to the position of price leader, which characterized our role in world oil markets for most of the industry's first century. We presumably will never return as the overwhelmingly dominant world producer. The position of the United States in price leadership and in the exercise of pricing power in oil markets dates back to John D. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. Reportedly appalled by the volatility of crude oil prices in the petroleum industry's early years, he endeavored, with some success, to control them. After the breakup of Standard Oil in 1911, pricing power remained with the American oil companies and later with the Texas Railroad Commission, which raised allowable output to suppress price spikes and cut output to prevent sharp declines. Indeed, U.S. crude oil production still accounted for more than half of the world total as late as 1952. However, that historic role came to an end in 1971 when excess capacity in the United States was finally absorbed by rising demand. At that point, the marginal pricing of oil, which for so long had been resident on the Gulf Coast of Texas, moved to the Persian Gulf. To capitalize on their newly acquired pricing power, many producing nations in the Middle East nationalized their oil companies. But the full magnitude of their pricing power became evident only in the aftermath of the oil embargo of 1973. During that period, posted crude oil prices at Ras Tanura in the Persian Gulf rose to more than $11 a barrel, significantly above the $1.80 per barrel that prevailed unchanged from 1961 through 1970. The sharp price rise in the early 1970s engendered an abrupt end to the extraordinary period of growth in U.S. oil consumption and the increased intensity of its use that was so evident in the decades immediately following World War II. Between 1945 and 1973, consumption of oil products rose at a startling 4.5% average annual rate, well in excess of the growth in the real GDP. Subsequent to 1973, however, oil consumption grew on average only 0.5% a year, far short of the rise in the real GDP, an issue to which I shall return shortly. But despite OPEC's persistent endeavors to control oil prices, the story since 1973 has been more one of the power of markets than one of market power. The signals provided by market prices have eventually resolved even the most seemingly insurmountable difficulties of inadequate domestic supply. The gap projected between supply and demand in the immediate post-1973 period was feared by many to be so large that rationing would be the only practical solution. But it did not quite happen that way. To be sure, mandated fuel efficiency standards for cars and light trucks accompanied slower growth of gasoline demand. However, some observers argue that even without government-enforced standards, market forces would have driven increased fuel efficiency. Indeed, the number of small, fuel-efficient Japanese cars that were imported into the United States markets increased significantly in the late 1970s after the Iranian Revolution drove up crude oil prices eventually to $40 a barrel. Moreover, at that time, prices were expected to go still higher. Projections of $50 a barrel or more were widely prevalent. The Department of Energy at that time had baseline projections showing prices reaching $60 a barrel, the equivalent of more than twice that in today's prices. The failure of oil prices to rise as projected in the late 1970s is a testament to the power of markets and the technologies they foster. Today, in real terms, the price of crude oil is 3/5 less than in December 1979. It is encouraging that in market economies, well-publicized forecasts of crises more often than not fail to develop, or at least not with the frequency and intensity proclaimed by headline writers. This was certainly the case for the concerns about potential surges in the price of gasoline this past summer. The reason, of course, is that producers and consumers alike react to price signals in ways that help to fend off the predicted disasters. This phenomenon was especially evident a year ago, when markets worked to help allocate limited supplies of fuel oil and to mitigate the problems that many had feared at the outset of the heating oil season in the United States, especially in the populous northeastern states where fuel oil is widely used for heating. In response to low inventories of home heating oil, prices rose, demand slowed, and we drew in large amounts of heating oil from Europe. In the event, retail prices peaked early last winter and have declined appreciably since. While the potential for a shortage of heating oil dominated concerns a year ago on the eastern seaboard, sharp increases in natural gas prices were threatening to markedly escalate the heating bills for the rest of the nation, which in fact they did for several months. A significant shortfall of gas and storage brought about by growing domestic demand and a limited ability to import had been a particular concern at the time. But since the start of the year, spot prices for natural gas have fallen significantly, largely because the earlier run-up in prices induced a dramatic rise in drilling, a boost in production, and a curtailment of demand. Of course, demand has also been restrained by the overall weakness of the economy. Responses to rising prices were also a major factor in stemming California's electric power crisis of earlier this year. when higher prices for wholesale electricity were finally allowed to be passed on to households and industry customers last spring, demand slowed dramatically. To be sure, had California experienced average summer weather, the partial pass-through of cost increases to the retail level arguably would have been inadequate to equilibrate demand and supply. But milder weather, coupled with a slowing economy, brought California through the summer with an ample buffer of excess capacity relative to peak loads. This was scarcely an exercise in free market economics or dynamics, but the experience did underscore that even the demand for electric power is price sensitive. Although the short-term problems of the past year in the markets for gasoline, natural gas, and electric power were resolved without significant disruption, these events and others over the past few years have brought renewed attention to the longer-term prospects for American energy markets. Largely in response to past oil price increases, the energy intensity of the United States economy has been reduced by almost half from the levels of the early 1970s. Much of the energy displacement was accomplished by 1985, within a few years of the peak in the real price of oil. Progress in reducing energy intensity has proceeded further since then, but at a lessened pace. This more modest pace should not be surprising, given the generally lower level of real oil prices that has prevailed since 1985. What has changed dramatically in recent years is the production side of the oil and gas markets, where technological changes are taking place that are likely to make existing energy reserves stretch further while keeping long-term energy costs lower than they otherwise would have been. The development of seismic techniques and satellite surveillance that are facilitating the discovery of promising new oil reservoirs worldwide have roughly doubled the drilling success rate for new field wildcat wells in the United States during the past decade. New techniques allow far deeper drilling of promising pools, especially offshore. The newer recovery innovations reportedly have raised the proportion of oil reserves eventually brought to the surface from 1/3 to nearly 1/2 in recent decades. One might expect that as a consequence of what has been a dramatic shift away from the hit or miss wildcat oil and gas exploration and development of the past to more advanced technologies, the cost of developing new fields, and hence the long-term marginal costs of new oil and gas, would have declined. And indeed, these costs have declined, but by less than might otherwise have been the case, because much of the innovation in oil development outside of OPEC has been directed at overcoming an increasingly inhospitable and costly exploratory environment. That has been the consequences of more than a century of draining the more immediately accessible sources of crude oil. One measure of the decline in the marginal cost of additions to oil availability in recent years is the downdrift in the prices of the most distant contracts for future delivery of light sweet crude oil. Spot prices have soared and plunged over the past decade, but for the most distant futures contracts, which cover a time frame long enough to seek, discover, drill, and lift oil, prices generally have moved lower. The most distant futures prices in 2001 dollars fell from $25 per barrel just before the Gulf War to $17 to $18 a barrel about a year and a half ago. The current 6-year futures contract has risen on net over the past year and is currently a little more than $20 a barrel. Arguably, however, this rise is related less to technology and the structure of underlying marginal costs and more, in all likelihood, to the future implications of current heightened Middle East tensions. The long-term marginal cost of extraction presumably anchors the long-term equilibrium price and thus is critical to an evaluation of the magnitude and persistence of any current price disturbance. Over time, spot prices are inexorably drawn back to the long-term equilibrium price as the balance between underlying supply and demand is restored. A premium over long-term marginal costs doubtless exists for oil because so much of the world's crude oil reserves are in areas where disruptive turmoil is always a latent threat. The longer-term outlook for natural gas prices is less tied down by history or current practice. Unlike oil, the natural gas consumed in the United States, as you know, is almost solely produced in the United States and in Canada, from which last year we imported 16% of our 23 trillion cubic feet of demand. The story of gas supply in the United States, in contrast to oil, is thus largely a domestic one. Compared with oil, the industry is relatively new. Natural gas, as you know, is more difficult to transport in its gaseous form through pipelines and particularly challenging in its cryogenic form when transported as a liquid. It is the latter problem that has kept imports of liquefied natural gas at negligible levels. Drilling technologies for natural gas have mirrored those for oil, and through much of the industry's history, one could not tell whether a successful drilling hit would turn up valuable crude oil or natural gas, which was often flared for the lack of transport facilities. But with many of the transportation hurdles surmounted, demand has surged over the past 2 decades, reflecting the myriad new uses for natural gas in industry and as a clean-burning source of electric power. At times in recent years, supply has not kept pace with the growth of demand. Indeed, the inventories of natural gas held in underground storage caverns were drawn down to record low day supply levels last winter. As a consequence, spot prices of gas quadrupled, engendering a surge in domestic drilling, as I indicated before. But the very technologies that have improved our drilling success rates have also enabled us to drain newly discovered gas reservoirs at an increasingly faster pace. Data for Texas, for example, show that in recent years, more than 50% of recoverable gas reserves were extracted from wells in the first year of operation, compared with roughly 25% in the 1980s. As a consequence, to achieve a rise in net marketed gas, gross new discoveries and the drilling activities associated with them have had to accelerate. The combination of demand for environmentally superior gas in our power plants and continued expansion of household and industrial use will be putting significant pressure on the reserve base as the economy recovers. Virtually all new electric power facilities now on the drawing board are gas-fired or dual-fired. To meet the higher anticipated needs, the always present trade-off between our energy requirements and our environmental concerns will doubtless be heightened in the years ahead. Such inevitable trade-offs have stimulated renewed interest in a greater expansion of coal, nuclear power, and non-conventional sources of energy. The nation, of course, has large reserves of coal, and in terms of thermal equivalence, we produce more of it than either natural gas or petroleum. Moreover, rapid technological improvements in coal mining have resulted in productivity gains in this industry that have exceeded those for the economy as a whole by a wide margin and have led to sizable declines in the relative price of coal. Still, the use of coal has been restrained by environmental concerns over emissions from coal-burning power plants. Technology has already alleviated some of these concerns, and given the realistic range of alternatives, coal is likely to remain a significant factor in our energy future. An obvious major alternative to coal in electric power generation is nuclear. Low prices for competing fuels and concerns about safety have been a drag on this industry. Nevertheless, its share of electricity production in the United States increased from less than 5% in 1973 to 20% about a decade ago and has since maintained that share. Given the steps that have been taken over the years to make nuclear energy safer and the obvious environmental advantages it has in terms of reducing emissions, the time may have come to consider whether we can overcome the impediments to tapping its potential more fully. Up front, of course, are the concerns of making plants safe from terrorist attacks. More difficult is the challenge of finding an acceptable way to store spent fuel and radioactive waste. If this problem can be resolved, and if some of the long-deferred research and development efforts to make nuclear power more economical were to bear fruit, the potential for this source of energy could doubtless be much enlarged. The remainder of our domestic energy production comes from a variety of renewable energy sources, the most prominent of which are hydroelectric power from dams and the energy generated through the recycling of waste and byproducts from industry and agriculture. Solar and wind power have proved economical in some small-scale and specialized uses, but together they account for only a tiny fraction of renewable energy. More broadly, substantial experimentation and exploration is underway in the application of advanced technologies to alternative approaches to energy production and conservation. Improvements in fuel cell technology, for example, hold considerable promise in a wide variety of commercial applications, and fuel-efficient hybrid cars are approaching wider use. With rapid scientific advances, it is not inconceivable that technological breakthroughs will allow non-conventional energy sources to play a larger role in meeting our demand for energy than is currently the case. In the more distant future remains the potentials of fusion power. A significant breakthrough in this area has been sought for years, but seems discouragingly beyond reach. But success could provide a major contribution to our nation's future power needs. The input costs of fusion power would be minor, and it produces negligible nuclear waste or pollutants. We cannot say with certainty how these technological possibilities will play out in the future, but we can say with some assurance that developments in energy markets will remain central in determining the longer-run health of our nation's economy. The experience of the past 50 years, and indeed much longer than that, suggests the important role that can be played by market forces in conserving scarce energy resources, directing those resources to their highest valued uses, and ultimately ensuring adequate productive capacity for the future. It is obvious that to successfully exploit new sources of energy, and the technologies that engender energy conservation will require considerable long-term investment in research, exploration, and development. An updated and improved means of energy transport, especially electric power transmission and distribution, will also be essential. To be sure, energy issues present policymakers and citizens with difficult decisions and trade-offs to make outside the market process. As always, national security and environmental concerns need to be addressed in setting policy. But those concerns should be addressed in a manner that, to the greatest extent possible, does not distort or stifle the meaningful functioning of our markets. We must remember that the same price signals that are so critical for balancing energy supply and demand in the short run also signal profit opportunities for long-term supply expansion. Moreover, they stimulate the research and development that will unlock new approaches to energy production and use that we can now only scarcely envision. Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
Now, Mr. Chairman, you were clear.
I'm sorry.
You were helpful. And we're going to take, if we can get a hold of that speech, we're going to send it to some of the people on the Hill that we think ought to read some of that. I know we're not going to have any questions, so you're going to leave today, leaving all of these folks what you think, what your views might be on an energy package, a trade package, and a stimulus package. Could we get a grin or a okay, fair deal.
It's a non-committal grin.
Non-committal grin. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming over. I think the points you made have very significant long-term implications here. We had a similar discussion earlier in the day on the whole financing and the issues on housing. We probably ought to pick 3 or 4 more. If we had the level of information you provided on energy and Frank provided on housing and a few other things, we might be forced to make decisions based on the facts. But we thank you very much for coming. I believe we're going to have a reception. Which side? Right next door in the briefing center. Please join us.
Let me welcome you to our afternoon program in behalf of the National Chamber Foundation. I'm Bill Little. I'm president of the Quam Nichols Company, and I'm chairman of the National Chamber Foundation. I'd like to, as a first order of business, thank Freddie Mac and the National Association of Business Economics for helping us organize this rather complex program that we're going to present this afternoon. Today, we will have a unique opportunity to take a very close look at the U.S. economy and get a sense of where things are heading. As we all know well, the events of September 11th tipped an already slowing economy into recession for the first time in more than 8 years. We've been through downturns before. As I look around the room, we've all been through downturns before. And we know what's needed: smart economic policies, creative thinking, hard work, and a restored consumer confidence. To help that process along, we've assembled what I believe is an incredible group of experts today to share solutions and to give outlooks for the economy as we head into the new year. We're going to begin our program this afternoon with one of the true leaders of the American business community, from one of the key sectors of our economy, Frank Raines. As president and CEO of Fannie Mae, Frank oversees the nation's largest source of mortgage financing. Fannie Mae has pledged to commit $2 trillion for affordable housing over the next 8 years. Home ownership is well known as a cornerstone of the American dream, a symbol of freedom and a pillar of our economic society. In addition to his knowledge of the housing sector, Frank has incredible insights into our entire economy, how it works, and more importantly, how we can improve it. Before he came to Fannie Mae, Frank was at the Office of Management and Budget, where he was the first director in a generation to oversee a balanced federal budget. Frank also serves on the board of such major organizations as Pfizer, AOL Time Warner, PepsiCo, the Enterprise Foundation, and the National Urban League. He's a prominent figure in the Washington community, a vocal leader nationally, and a great friend of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Frank Raines.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you, Bill Little, for that terrific introduction. Let me also give my thanks to Tom Donahue and Steve Van Endel for inviting me to be with you here today. Let me start just by taking this opportunity to pay a tribute to President Bush and to Vice President Cheney for their leadership in these very trying times facing the nation. They have helped to restore our spirits, and they've helped to restore our economy during very difficult times since September 11th. Abraham Lincoln, in his most with the occasion. In our moment of national tribulation, I think that President Bush and Vice President Cheney have led the entire nation to rise to the occasion that is before us. Let me also take this opportunity to give long overdue thanks to the Chamber for the support that you